their time away from social interactions. Which one were you?
I think I am neither. I've been so desperate to go out and see my friends all the time.
Really?
But one thing I did like about lockdown was that it alleviated the pressure of like, what have you been up to? Because we'd all been up to the same thing. I think often that pressure of like not just being up to work, but also the social engagement, so that when people catch up with you, you have things to tell them. It's like,
Well, this Dr. Kirsty Ross actually did note too. She noted in her in this article that conversations were actually quite repetitive, very cut and paste. How are you doing today, Jenny? And that was one thing that not got people down, but people were a little bit over, perhaps.
Definitely. Me and my friends found ways to kind of like organise our nights. So like every Friday night we'd have a Zoom quiz. Someone would run a quiz, we'd all make teams. So we kind of ended up finding these creative ways to make those social occasions something fun to look forward to and something different and something easy to do that wasn't just like, trying to catch up and talk, because everyone had just been doing the same thing every single day. But it did, I have felt a bit nostalgic for it recently. Just the
Have you?
Just the lack of the pressure, you know?
The busy badge.
Yeah. I think
Busy
as a
badge.
freelancer especially, it's like, God, you've got to keep working and hustling and hustling. And that was like, you don't for a little bit.
What did you make of what Dr. Ross said there, Jenny?
Well, you see, I consider myself an introverted extrovert anyway. So, I like doing things like this. I like going to work. I like talking to people. But I also really crave solitude and time on my own. My family also know that about me. And so, lockdown was kind of played into that part of me. And when it came time to be going out again, I wasn't rushing out the door desperate to see people. I was sort of quite happy to slowly meander back into it. I love my friends. I just like time on my own as well. And
what did Kirsty say, that notion of aloneness?
Yes, yeah. And also there is this whole thing that that we do feel like we have to fill our lives with activities and things, and that if you actually just want to sit at home and read your book, that there's kind of something wrong with you. But actually it's really healthy for resetting, especially if you do have a busy life. So
Not for Eli. Can't wait to get out the door and go clubbing, eh?
No, ready to hit those clubs. That's me. That's me.
Eli's a bit younger than me. Maybe he's got a bit more of a, an active pub-hopping lifestyle or something.
Yeah, some wonderful feedback today regarding, let's have a look at this living wage. Cleaners, security guards, supermarket workers, market gardeners, rubbish collectors, elderly care workers and support workers are all on minimum wage, yet we're essential workers who are told to risk their lives for peanuts. Good on the banks, but can we all do better by being kinder and more generous? Helga in Sandringham says, I've never understood how it's not okay to pay a living wage. It means that the rest of us must subsidise that person, which effectively subsidises the shareholders of the business. How is that okay? And Palmerston North, Margaret didn't agree with the ring road. I've lived in Palmerston North, now live in Hamilton. The ring road around the western route is clogged with crawling traffic, 6 days, if not 7 a week. How are we to cut emissions with Think Big transport promises? And one person asks, when's Eli's next gig in Palmerston North?
Oh, follow me on Twitter.
No, don't worry about it. Yeah.
They are great, though. I did the massive uni orientation.
Sure. Eli Matthewson and Jenny Morden, thank you very much for joining me. Wallace Chapman back for Wednesday. See you then.
Te whakarongo mai koe ki te reo irirangi o Aotearoa. This is Checkpoint on RNZ National. I'm Lisa Owen. E haere nei, very, very soon is when the PM says we can expect a decision on charging for mandatory isolation. It's complicated, says a public law expert. She'll explain exactly why. New Zealand suspends its extradition treaty with Hong Kong over China's new national security law. China bites back, saying that's a gross interference and a violation of international law. The National Party's secret internal polling is not so secret after all. And speaking of polling, how well do voters understand the end of life and cannabis referendums? The dispute over paramedics' pay is heading to court, and why some businesses are still buzzing about the America's Cup.
RNZ News at 5. Kia ora ko Susana Leata with tēnei. The Chinese government is accusing New Zealand of gross interference in its affairs with the decision to suspend extradition with Hong Kong. China passed a national security law at the end of June, criminalising forms of political protest in Hong Kong with penalties including life imprisonment. A spokesperson at the Chinese embassy in Wellington says the suspension is a violation of international law. The Foreign Minister Winston Peters says the law goes against commitments China's previously made to the international community.
In 1997 there was a one country, two systems commitment by China. It's clear now that the law is no longer what it was, and therefore the extradition arrangements we have don't stand up.
Winston Peters says the treaty's been suspended because New Zealand can no longer trust that Hong Kong's criminal justice system is sufficiently independent from China. The Prime Minister says a decision on charging New Zealanders for managed isolation will be made very, very soon. Jacinda Ardern says negotiations between the governing parties are ongoing and she is confident they will come to a consensus. The Greens have said they will not support a co-payment regime that charges New Zealanders who are already overseas. Ms Ardern says the government has considered a range of different circumstances as part of its negotiations.
When you're already here in New Zealand and you're making a deliberate decision to go overseas, that's something quite different to someone who's overseas returning to New Zealand, and so there are different considerations there.
Jacinda Ardern thinks there is a lot of sympathy for expats who are caught up in the pandemic through no fault of their own. The government has identified 170 close contacts of a person who tested positive for COVID-19 after arriving in South Korea from New Zealand. The Health Minister says the individual left Christchurch last Tuesday and arrived in South Korea the next day after transiting through Singapore. Chris Hipkins says passengers from the 2 rows around the traveller on flight NZ555 and the traveller's family members are being asked to isolate and get tests. The Justice Minister, Andrew Little, says there's no such thing as full-term abortion and is calling out MPs claiming there is. National MP Hare Te Hipango has come under fire for a Facebook post accusing the Prime Minister of supporting abortion up to full term. Abortion reform legislation, which takes it out of the Crimes Act, was passed by a conscience vote in Parliament in March. For an abortion to take place after 20 weeks, several criteria have to be met. Mr Little says Ms Hipango's comments are silly.
If Judith Collins is happy to have a bunch of kind of radical anti-abortion extremists kind of running the show on social media, that's mad for her. If she wants to rein them in, she should do. If she's happy to let them go, then no doubt she will do that.
Nationals leader Judith Collins voted in favour of reform and says MPs are allowed their own views. Ricky Wang's mother still doesn't know he is dead, nearly 3 years after he was killed and his body buried in the Central Plateau. Mr Wang's close friend Piao Yanglong was today sent to prison for 14 months for helping to cover up the killing, which included telling his family that he'd gone overseas. Justice Chagos described the impact of Piao's actions.
Mr Wang's family are victims of your offending, being disadvantaged by it. Mr Wang was his parents' only child. His father has kept news of his death from his mother for fear her frail health could not stand the shock as he experienced, suffering a heart attack and weight loss.
Justice Chagos in the High Court at Auckland. The opposition National Party has brought in its pollster to brief MPs in a bid to discredit this week's devastating public poll result. Nationals leader Judith Collins has spent the week dismissing the News Hub Reid research survey as rogue, saying the party's support is much higher than the 25% reported. RNZ's been told Nationals pollster David Farrer briefed MPs on the party's internal polling this morning. The key numbers shared had National on 36% and Labour just behind 50%. It's coming up to 4.5 minutes past 5. The Springboks coach Jacques Nienaber has indicated they're doubtful starters for this year's Rugby Championship, casting a cloud over the Sanzar tournament. Nienaber fears his players won't be physically ready for the Four Nations event, which is due to be played entirely in New Zealand in November and December. He says there's a vast discrepancy in readiness for his players compared to those in New Zealand and Australia, which have had their own domestic Super Rugby competitions. There has been no rugby in South Africa and Argentina due to COVID-19. Taking on the top job of coaching the Silver Ferns appeals to outgoing Central Pulse coach Yvette McCausland-Jury, but it's some way off yet. McCausland-Jury is stepping down at the end of the season as the Pulse chase back-to-back ANZ Premiership titles. She has been the Silver Ferns assistant coach previously and eventually succeeding Dame Nolene Taurua seems to appeal.
Being involved and engaged with this level of player is something that I've enjoyed. It's such a challenge. They're just incredible. They want to get better. They're constantly challenging you to make sure that they get better. So, yeah, look, if there's opportunities ahead, I'll take them. But, right now I've just got to try and get to this grand final.
Yvette McCausland-Jury. And former Kiwis and Warriors coach Frank Endicott has been made a life member of New Zealand Rugby League after 65 years of service to the game. That's the news.
Polls.
I think the poll numbers are very good. The poll numbers we have are very good.
Poison.
The instructions on these various products are to drink them in increasing doses until you vomit, and then to cut back on the dose a little bit.
Parents and pupils.
The parents talked about what a positive experience that was to be able to sit down with their child and really engage with them and help them with their maths learning.
Public Radio, Morning Report, 6 till 9, weekdays on air and online.
Now the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow for Northland, Coromandel and Bay of Plenty. Partly cloudy with isolated light showers, clearing Bay of Plenty tomorrow morning. Auckland to Wellington, including Taumaranui and Taupo, fine and cloudy periods, isolated showers in Waikato, areas of fog north of Whanganui tomorrow morning. Gisborne to Wairarapa, also Taihape, fine, some high cloud, areas of morning frost or fog. Nelson, Buller and Northern Westland, cloud increasing, a few showers tonight. Southern Westland and Fiordland, cloud increasing, periods of rain tonight. Marlborough and Canterbury, high cloud, however, areas of low cloud or fog affecting eastern Canterbury at times. Otago and Southland, high cloud, rain at times tomorrow. Chatham Islands, cloudy periods. RNZ National. It's almost 7 minutes past 5.
Thanks, Susanna. This is Checkpoint and I'm Lisa Owen. Very, very soon, that's when the government says we can expect a decision on how and when returning New Zealanders will be charged for their stay in isolation hotels. Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern says an announcement will be made very shortly and she's confident she won't have to reach across the aisle to National to get the regime over the line. And with the Greens laying out their bottom line, it appears increasingly likely only New Zealanders heading away now for holidays or business trips will have to foot the bill. Here's our political reporter Yvette McCullough.
After weeks of discussions, a decision on charging returning New Zealanders is imminent. And with only 2 weeks left to pass legislation before Parliament rises for the term, it needs to be. Jacinda Ardern is dismissing suggestions the coalition partners struggling to get consensus is the reason for the hold-up.
It would be wrong to assume that it's simply party discussions that are taking time. This is a complex issue and drafting legislation is a complex thing to do.
Greens co-leader James Shaw says they are now in the concluding round of negotiations. And for his party, charging New Zealanders that are stuck overseas is unacceptable.
If somebody knows they are going overseas for a short trip or for a business trip, given the cost of this, there is a case to be made. But for people who have left before the legislation with absolutely no idea that this was going to happen to them, then that's unfair and it's retrospective.
He says many expat Kiwis are stranded, facing job losses or expiring visas. He says the focus should be on fairness, not revenue grabbing.
That's presumably part of the consideration. I mean, it is an expensive proposition, but my point is that COVID-19, everything is expensive. The whole public health response is a tremendous cost, but it is worth it because everything that we have done has kept New Zealanders safe and we want to maintain that stance.
New Zealand First Leader Winston Peters wants everyone to pay, except under extraordinary circumstances.
Sometimes there'll be humanitarian reasons, they're forced by circumstances, not of their own volition, to have to come home. And then, of course, you've got circumstances where people are flat broke and can in the long term pay.
Despite the different stances, Ms Ardern is confident she won't have to rely on the opposition's support.
No, that's not our intent. Obviously as a government, we feel confident that we will have a plan that we'll be able to present very shortly.
If elected, National is promising to charge adults up to $3,000 for using isolation hotels. Leader Judith Collins says while they would support exemptions on compassionate or medical grounds, they want to see a blanket charge.
There's not a lot of tolerance out in places like Papakura, in my electorate, for people to take extended overseas holidays, and that we all get to pay the cost.
She says the government needs to work with the opposition on this.
They need to actually start treating this as a cross-party issue. We have, in principle, agreement, but we need to know the detail, and we cannot sign up until we've seen it.
But with Ms Ardern signalling a consensus decision is coming very, very shortly, it will be her coalition partners, not national, she'll be focused on appeasing. From Parliament for Checkpoint, Yvette McCullough.
Charging returning Kiwis for isolation is a complicated proposition, according to a public law expert who recommends the government pass a completely new piece of legislation to get the job done. But Mei Chen reckons the bigger challenge is the ticking clock, with Parliament due to break up in 2 weeks' time.
We've got a situation where we want to ensure that we are properly treating everybody fairly. They do have a right to movement. Citizens have a right to come back to the country. If they can't come back to the country, they can't access their families, their houses, their jobs. So obviously we then need to also have exemptions. Some people aren't going to be able to afford that, but they still need to come back. So what do we do? Do we give them exemptions? Do we means test them? The issue here is being fair. Enforcement is also hard. What happens if they don't pay? Are you going to throw them in jail? How are you going to penalise them? How are you going to enforce this? And also, there are issues about cost recovery. Some people have said, well, look, it's a blanket yes or a blanket no. If you try and have everybody making an application, I've got a good excuse for being back. I don't. I just decided to hop out and spend some time in Paris and come back, and therefore I should pay. It just makes it too hard. It costs too much. It's like the GST argument. By the time you've figured out all the exemptions, it's easier just to have a blanket charge. So I don't think it's easy.
So in terms of the right to return home to New Zealand, if you're a citizen or a permanent resident, is that a supreme right, or are there some circumstances where they can charge you? For example, that may exclude you from returning if you don't have the means to pay. So what is the supreme right here? Is it your right as a citizen or a permanent resident?
That's why I say legislation is a good idea, because Parliament is sovereign. And at the end of the day, passing legislation trumps all. The New Zealand Bill of Rights says that every New Zealand citizen has the right to enter New Zealand, but it's subject to Section 5, which says that you're able to be subject to reasonable limitations demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. So let's face it, public health justification. Look, it's absolutely critical. At the moment we have a policy in New Zealand of elimination. We've got no community transmission. That border defence is absolutely critical to us. So you could argue that because of that, limitations can be put on the right to freedom of movement. But let's face it, if you're a citizen and you leave the country and you can't get back in and you can't afford it, I think that's just going to be too gross an imposition. Most importantly, Lisa, are we going to spend all our time in court? Is everyone going to have to challenge, grab a lawyer, do-si-do, head down to court and say, well, hang on, this was demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society, this wasn't. The difficulty here is to come up with some sort of scheme that isn't going to be the subject of constant court challenge. But at the same time, Parliament is rising next week. So if they want to pass legislation, they're going to have to get the bill drafted, make sure it's workable and practical, get it into Parliament, pass it through all three stages. I presume this means that the select committee stage will be totally truncated. We've now got, expats in London who've formed a group and are going to try and challenge. We've got a challenge group in New Zealand. This isn't easy. And I think given all of these challenge groups, it really points the pathway also to legislation. Legislation trumps all. You get a piece of legislation that says you are able to do this in these circumstances, very hard to challenge it.
But given all the issues that you've just outlined, the time that there is to get this done, is it worth it?
I think it is because, we're being told that they've already spent $750 million. That's a lot of money. It's your money, it's my money, it's taxpayers' money. The question is whether it's sustainable. And look, let's face it, if some people just want to zot out and have a quick holiday, well, they can pay on their way back. But if you happen to be overseas and there's no other way to come home and you can't afford, $3,000 at the border, well, that may be a different story. So the question is, how do you devise a system with clear discretionary ability to take into account the facts of everyone's situation, but not make it so complicated that it just eats up a whole bunch of resource to implement it, and you end up with just a huge rolling maul of court cases with people challenging.
So what would be a reasonable limitation on your return in terms of a financial limitation? So if you then have to choose a figure that's a limitation, having to pay, a limitation on your freedom of movement, what's a reasonable financial limitation then, by definition?
Well, you see, what's reasonable depends on how much you earn, Lisa. If you don't earn very much, when I act for people who don't earn very much, what is reasonable for them is completely different. So I think the means testing is important. And remember, part of the reason why we also need legislation is that at the moment, the government's saying to people, feel free, come back, we'll foot the bill. You go to the Sheraton for 2 weeks. And actually, there's no ability for them to do that either. There's no piece of legislation that says actually you can just pay for everybody who's coming back in to the tune of, 750 million and, heading towards $1 billion. So that's why I say this is complicated. And when the Honourable Megan Woods says it's complicated, she's right, because you are having to make those decisions taking into account the facts of every person's situation. And that includes their means, but it also includes why they are wanting to come back in and why they left.
So if you're paying, does that mean you should have some choice? For example, some people would consider that some of the hotels on offer are much better than others. So if you're going to be forced to pay, should you then have choice?
Oh, I love it. So we're going to have a wait list for the Hyatt because you don't want to go to the Commodore or the Copthorne. Look, at the end of the day, this is about public health and safety. So I think there are limits to the extent of discretion you have. And it's also clear, Lisa, that, whatever they're going to charge you is not how much it's going to cost. We know that because it doesn't, it may pay for the food and it may pay for your room, but it's not going to pay for the security. If we continue to have to put people to stop you cutting your way through gates, fences, breaking windows. There's going to be a much, much higher cost. So at the end of the day, there's going to be a bit of user pays. So we need to be realistic about that. You're not going to be footing the whole bill. So I think you go where you are told. COVID has fundamentally changed the relationship between government and citizens. In the bid to protect all of our health and safety, we still need to ensure that there is lawfulness and transparency because people's rights are being affected.
So, May, here's the checkpoint challenge then. Given that there's 2 weeks before the House rises, could you write a rock-solid piece of legislation that accounts for all these nuances? Well, we'll give you 7 to 10 days because you still have to get it before the House. Can you do it?
Well, that is so generous of you, Lisa. And I'd accept the challenge. If I was going to do it, I would stand back. I'd probably make it quite permissive. I wouldn't make it too prescriptive. It's easier to get it wrong when it's highly prescriptive. Probably what I'd do is I'd give quite a bit of power, but then I'd say that they could draft regulations, which can then provide the detail.
And that's May Chen, public law expert. It is 19 minutes after 5 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Let us know what you think about the thorny issue of whether people should be paying for managed isolation. Should we have exemptions? If we do, what should they be? Who exactly should be charged? And do we need to bring it in before the election? You can text us on 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ or flick us an email, checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. China has accused New Zealand of gross interference in China's internal affairs after the government here suspended its extradition treaty with Hong Kong. New Zealand says the law that criminalises political protest with penalties such as life imprisonment undermines the one country, two systems framework and goes against past commitments from China. It's leaving the door open for the future, saying it's willing to review the decision if China returns to treating Hong Kong the way it promised to in 1997. Here's our political editor, Jane Patterson.
New Zealand's Five Eyes partners, the UK, the US, Canada and Australia, suspended their extradition treaties with Hong Kong earlier this month after the passage of the new national security law. Today, New Zealand followed suit.
We've undertaken a full analysis after we saw those dramatic changes with the introduction of new national security legislation in Hong Kong. Our view, of course, is that that has undermined the one country, two systems approach and Hong Kong's common law.
But Jacinda Ardern told reporters she did not believe it would damage the relationship with China.
We do have a mature relationship with China. There have been occasions where we have taken different positions. This obviously will be one of them. But we take the same approach to our relationship we always have. We've been very consistent. We'll be open where there are areas where we have to adjust our position. This is a clear one for us based on New Zealand's principles.
In a strongly worded statement, a spokesperson for China's embassy said the suspension was a gross interference in China's internal affairs. It said the decision was a serious violation of international law governing international relations, and the Chinese side had lodged its grave concern and strong opposition. It went on to say Hong Kong affairs are entirely China's internal affairs and allow no foreign interference. But New Zealand's Foreign Minister Winston Peters says China has gone back on its word.
In 1997 there was a one country, two systems commitment by China. It's clear now that the law is no longer what it was, and therefore the extradition arrangements we have don't stand up. But if they should go back to honouring the commitment of 1997, then we'd revisit our situation as well.
He too was asked whether he expected there'd be any pushback from China.
I've always said that when we are given commitments by China, I believe them, and I expect them to uphold their commitments.
Waikato Professor of International Law Alexander Gillespie says the decision is the right one, and New Zealand is now closer to the positions taken by its Five Eyes partners. He says New Zealand will be watching China's response closely, and the consequences for the relationship may not be immediately obvious.
It's more likely that you could see exports held up for technical reasons, or a slow or a delay in getting product to market. Trade is where we are particularly vulnerable. We have a relationship that's worth $30 billion per year. It's top-heavy in exports, $17 billion of that going to China. And so just a small restriction in that, or a small kind of halting of that, could have a big impact on New Zealand.
National's Foreign Affairs spokesperson Simon Bridges welcomes the move.
I don't think we can be silent. We have to stand up for our values in this area around democracy, the rule of law and human rights.
But he questions the time New Zealand has taken to make the decision.
I don't want to be unduly critical. I do think it has been slow, though. I note that in recent communiques, or certainly a communique from the Five Eyes partners, they were in a position of condemning the law. At that time, our government, through Minister Peters, effectively expressed concern somewhat below where they were.
The UK has offered safe haven visas to some Hong Kong residents, and Australia has also made changes to allow some visa holders to stay longer. The New Zealand government says a safe haven visa to this country is not something it's considering. From Parliament for Checkpoint, Jane Patterson.
And in addition to the statement that you heard there in Jane's package, the Embassy of the People's Republic of China in New Zealand says any attempt to pressure China on the issue of Hong Kong will not succeed. The Chinese side urges the New Zealand side to abide by the international law and the basic norms governing international relations, immediately stop interfering in Hong Kong affairs and China's internal affairs in any forms to avoid further harm to China-New Zealand relations. That from the Embassy of the People's Republic of China in New Zealand. Ambulance workers are launching a legal challenge over what they say is a demoralising about turn on a planned pay boost from St John. First Union has lodged an application with the Employment Relations Authority, claiming St John has breached an agreement to pay weekend and overnight shift rates. St John says it's facing a $30 million shortfall and can't afford the rates right now. And paramedics say they're in the middle of an ongoing funding debacle. And as Nita Blake-Person reports, they're questioning whether St John is the right outfit to be running the ambulance service.
Talking to media is a big deal for St John paramedics. Interviews are banned under most contracts. But after St John announced it would not be able to pay staff the weekend and overnight shift rate that was agreed to after strike action last year, this man decided to speak up.
money to help us out for all these unsociable hours would have gone a long way. And people were quite passionate during the industrial action about it. And to be told 3 weeks out that, no, we're not going to get it, has just been demoralising.
He's been working as a paramedic for the past 17 years and says the affordability issue comes up time and time again, and further strike action could be on the cards.
They're more than happy to take up where they left off. They're quite passionate about it in the first place, and just to be kicked in the guts again and said all that fighting we did, they're just not paying attention to it. A few people are quite angry about it. The morale of all the stations is just bad.
St John, which is 70% government funded, announced last month it needed to claw back $30 million over the next financial year after COVID-19 and the lockdown limited its fundraising. That meant that penal rates, which were agreed to after last year's industrial action and were due to come into effect from the 1st of July, haven't been able to be paid. The charity says the rates were subject to affordability and an independent market review, which has since been completed and advised a different approach. But Sarah Stone from First Union, which represents nearly 1,200 ambulance workers, says that's not good enough.
And so they haven't applied for funding to cover it. They haven't produced any evidence to show that they can't afford it. And so our only option left was to go and file it with the Employment Relations Authority and take them to court and settle the matter in court. You know, members feel it's disingenuous of St John, and they don't really believe that they ever intended to pay the shift pay.
St John pay rates range from $20.50 an hour for the lowest paid ambulance staff to $26.48 for an emergency medical technician. Paramedics get $34.10 an hour. St John says it's been paying staff a 5% unsociable hours shift allowance since the end of last year, an interim measure until the penal rates of time and a quarter were due to come into effect. The paramedic Checkpoint has spoken to says the current funding shortfall raises bigger questions about how the company is run.
Every year they keep saying, we can't afford this, we can't afford that. If you're a charity that can't afford it and you can't run it as it needs to be, then maybe it's time you don't run it. And maybe the government needs to step in and say, we need to bring this in line with FENS and police and run it as a proper emergency service, not as a charity.
Mark Quinn is an intensive care paramedic and spokesman for another union, the New Zealand Ambulance Association. He says St John are the right outfit to run things, but their government funding needs a massive boost.
I think St John is the right organisation to be providing the ambulance services. When I hear calls of wanting to have a nationalised ambulance service or another provider, it doesn't necessarily mean that the services will be any better, or certainly the conditions will be any better for the ambulance officers.
In a statement, the Ministry of Health said it had given a short-term funding boost to road ambulance providers for additional staffing in this year's budget. That $36.5 million over 4 years was in addition to the $25 million that the government handed out last year to ambulance services to relieve financial pressure. St John says it's begun to implement $30 million worth of cost-saving measures, and the government is acutely aware of its financial position. It says it's hopeful there will be additional support from its funders. For Checkpoint, Nita Blakeperson.
Coming up on Checkpoint on RNZ National, the National Party's secret internal poll numbers. We'll let you in on the secret. So was it a rogue poll or not? The meaty issue she'll be asked to vote on at the election, and we'll have a look at how Auckland's shaping up for the America's Cup. Love to hear from you, so let us know your thoughts. Do you have someone overseas planning to return home? What do you think about shelling out for managed isolation? Some of you are already getting in touch about it. Jean has said, how about a voluntary donation to pay for isolation, either by the returnee of their family, in gratefulness of having their family member safely back home? Interesting concept, Jean. I wonder if people would rise to that challenge. Tom says New Zealanders who have been overseas for more than 6 months haven't been paying taxes, so they should pay a fee for their quarantine. Dom reckons that people's main fear in being charged for quarantine is that they will be expected to pay a lump sum up front. I would have thought that a loan scheme similar to the one students have would be floated. Dave says, let's keep it simple. Anyone leaving after lockdown for holiday or business pays $3,000. Kids on OEs coming home get in for free. This person doesn't agree, though. No returning New Zealander should have to pay to come home. We don't pay to go to hospital. Kim, on the other hand, likes Mei Chen's exemption suggestions in legislation. We need some user pays, as it's not sustainable for all of us forking out. Very limited exemptions, though. And this one in from Roger, who says they could pay for some food. They would be eating somewhere and using power. If at their parents' house, then perhaps they could contribute a little. If my child was returning, I would expect them to pay something. Actually, that's from Vicky. Thanks for getting in touch, Vicky. If you would like to join that discussion, get in touch via text. It's 2101. Tweet us at checkpointrnz or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. It's time now, though, for the headlines with Susanna.
China's government has called New Zealand's decision to suspend extradition with Hong Kong gross interference. The national security law passed by China at the end of June criminalises forms of political protest in Hong Kong with penalties including life imprisonment. The Chinese embassy in Wellington says the suspension is a violation of international law. A public law expert says there will have to be exemptions if the government decides to start charging New Zealanders for managed isolation. The Prime Minister has promised a decision very, very soon, but says there are a lot of considerations. Mei Chen told Checkpoint the difficulty is to come up with a scheme that isn't going to be the subject of constant court challenge. The opposition has brought in its pollster to brief MPs in a bid to discredit this week's devastating public poll result, which put it at 25%. RNZ has been told David Farrer briefed MPs on the party's internal polling this morning. The key numbers shared had National on 36% and Labour near 50%. The mother of Ricky Wang, who was killed and buried in the Central Plateau in 2017, still doesn't know he is dead for fear her frail health could not stand the shock her father experienced. Mr Wang's close friend Piao Yenlong was today sent to prison for 14 months for helping to cover up the killing, which included telling his family that he'd gone overseas. The government has identified 170 close contacts of a person who tested positive for COVID-19 after arriving in South Korea from Christchurch last Tuesday. The Health Minister says passengers from the 2 rows around the traveller on flight NZ555 and the traveller's family members are being asked to isolate and get tests. Former Malaysian Prime Minister Najib Razak has been found guilty on all 7 corruption charges in his first trial linked to a multi-billion-dollar scandal at State Sovereign Wealth Fund 1MDB. The judge in the Kuala Lumpur High Court said the prosecution had successfully proven its case beyond a reasonable doubt. Those are the latest news headlines from RNZ National. Our next news and weather update is at 6.
Thanks, Susanna. If you're just joining us, this is Checkpoint and I'm Lisa Owen. I've just had something handed to me. It's breaking news. It says that this is in relation to the person who's tested positive for COVID in South Korea. It says, I'm just trying to work out who it's from. It's from Countdown. We were contacted by the Canterbury DHB in relation to the movements of a person they are contact tracing. This is in relation to the person who has tested positive for COVID in South Korea, not a new case. Our store is thoroughly cleaned each day, but as is our process, we have closed it as a precaution to undertake a deeper clean today. Now, this is a store that I understand is the Countdown at Spitfire Square, which is near Christchurch Airport. So that has been shut down today for a deeper clean after being identified as a premise that this person is connected with. And they go on to say any further questions should be directed to the Ministry of Health. That was from Countdown. So one of their stores, part of the contact tracing there, and shut down for a deep clean. Well, Nicholas Poynton is standing very by in the studio to discuss business. Hi, Nicholas.
Hello.
Mainzeal, day 2 of their appeal. This is a complicated saga, so break down what's happened today for us.
Yeah, so a big day in court today. So yesterday, for the briefest of recaps, yesterday the court heard why 3 of the 4 directors who were on trial last year, they heard why their arguments for why they weren't reckless to continue to trade the company when it was technically insolvent. And this morning that moved to, if they are liable, how should those costs actually be calculated? Because I'm sure you can imagine it's really hard to determine. There's no straightforward way. There's no gold standard for the court to determine how much money was actually lost when the company's directors made the decision to continue trading in 2010. At the moment, that amount is set at $36 million. The liquidators, who are actually cross-appealing, they say that should be doubled. But there is also actually a belief, this hasn't been said yet, but there is a belief that the liquidators will actually push for the board's chair, the former Prime Minister Dame Jenny Shipley, to actually pay more. So today, anticipating this, Dame Jenny's lawyer, Michael Arthur, says, nah, that's not fair. He says to order her to pay more as the chair infers that she has a higher level of responsibility, but that was never spoken to or clarified throughout any of these court processes. He also says that as the chair, she has no additional power. She's not privy to any information that the other directors are not. Effectively, she's just another seat around the table. He also speaks to the precedent that if they do decide to hold each director liable, what precedent that would set, because you can imagine in future examples where a company goes bust, you could almost envision directors all trying to rush and wash their hands off and saying that they're not liable at all. Imagine the director who has no accounting experience, who says, oh well, I didn't understand what was going on in the books, how can I be responsible? I couldn't see what was going on. And you can see how that could spiral on and on. So Dame Jenny's lawyer says the High Court judge should have considered a nil or a nominal sum for the damages at the time. So that's where it rounded out for three of the four directors. This afternoon, we finally heard from the lawyers for the fourth director. This is Richard Yan. So he was on the board of Mainzeal, but also on the board for the parent company.
Right.
And remember, this is the parent company that told Mainzeal, if you ever get into trouble, we're going to have your back. We're going to support you. Well, that never actually happened. So their lawyers put forward more or less a similar case to the other directors. They say he was not liable, but he's actually been ordered to pay $18 million, while the other directors have been asked to pay $6 million each. His lawyers say that's far too much, and given how much the other directors are having to pay. Then finally this afternoon, as things began to wrap up, we heard from Mark O'Brien QC, so he's the lawyer for the liquidators, and he came out swinging. He says the collapse of this company was totally predictable. It was an accident waiting to happen. He says they should never have relied on the support of the parent company. He says while there were instances that this company had supported Mainzeal, it was not in an overall position to support the company. So we can expect him to get absolutely stuck into the submissions tomorrow. His premise is basically this was avoidable. There was no need for these creditors to continue to trade this company, and it's left creditors out of pocket.
Remind us, is it for the whole week set down for?
Yep. So this is for 5 days been set aside. So hopefully on Friday I'll come here and we'll have
a conclusion of some sort. Anyway.
Of some sort, yeah.
Yeah. What's been going on the markets, Nicholas?
So today the NZX top 50 is actually down a touch by 7 points to 11,588. The New Zealand dollar is down by 1/3% to 66.6 US cents, down to 93.2 Australian, and steady at 51.8 British pence. And special mention to gold again, it's up to $1,944 US an ounce, and we can't forget its poorer cousin. Silver's having a bit of a cameo. It's up nearly 0.5% to $24 US an ounce.
Unfortunately, we don't have any of those. That's Nicholas Poynton with our business news. The government has identified 170 close contacts of a person who tested positive for COVID-19 after arriving in South Korea from New Zealand. The South Korean government believes the person most likely caught COVID in Singapore. But the Health Minister, Chris Hipkins, says the government wants to rule out any community transmission here. He says those close contacts, including 5 family members and people sitting near the traveller on a flight from Christchurch to Auckland, will be asked to get tested and self-isolate.
We're still implementing our response as if it was a worst-case scenario, out of an abundance of caution. So, as I've said, there's no evidence of community transmission, and there's the people that we have contacted thus far are all well, so the people in the household where the person had been staying are all well, but we are being very cautious and undertaking the contact tracing to give that certainty. We will understand more as more investigations are done about what has actually happened here, but it takes a while to piece all of that together.
The Director-General of Health, Dr Ashley Bloomfield, confirmed there is 1 new case of COVID-19 in managed isolation today. He says the woman in her 20s returned from Afghanistan via Dubai on the 14th of July.
She's been staying at the Distinction Hotel in Hamilton and tested negative around day 3 of her stay. But then at day 12, regular testing returned a weak positive test and has since been transferred to the quarantine facility in Auckland. Again, this case reinforces the rationale behind our approach of testing people twice during their stay. Most of the cases we are detecting in managed isolation are detected at the day 3 testing, but some people do not develop the infection to a point where they will test positive until later in the incubation period. And so we have the day 12 testing, and a negative day 12 test is a requirement, of course, for being able to leave the facility.
Dr Bloomfield says the total number of active cases is 21 and no one is receiving hospital-level care. And as we mentioned, that case in South Korea is related to the closure of a Christchurch countdown near the airport there. It has been closed for a deeper clean. The first person who escaped managed isolation has pleaded guilty to failing to comply with an order under the COVID-19 Public Health Response Act. Suzanne Marie Durrett appeared in the Dunedin District Court this morning, where she admitted climbing over a brick wall and hedge and running away from the Pullman Hotel in Auckland on July the 4th, 7 days before her required isolation period ended. Our Otago Southland reporter Timothy Brown was in court and has all the detail.
Susan Derrett arrived in Auckland from Brisbane on June the 27th and was taken to the Pullman Hotel. She was told she would remain there for a fortnight, but a week later she fled the hotel's courtyard and ran away. A summary of facts presented in court today says on the evening of July the 4th, she displayed signs of emotional distress. She was yelling and talking to herself. After re-entering the hotel and then going back to the courtyard, she yelled at staff through the glass window before facing the northwest corner of the courtyard, and a few minutes later jumped over the brick wall and ran away. Less than 2 hours later, she approached police officers in Anzac Avenue, a few hundred metres away from the hotel in Auckland CBD, and was arrested.
Do we know how difficult it was for her to get out, how high the fences were?
The fence was approximately 5 foot tall, and on the other side of the brick wall was a hedge of a similar height. So it was a matter of climbing up and over them and then just making her way through the hedge.
So, now that we've got to this point, what is the possible punishment? You know, what's she likely facing in terms of a sentence?
Well, under the COVID-19 Public Health Response Act, she can potentially be jailed for up to 6 months or be fined $4,000. However, those extremes are very unlikely, and at today's hearing, the police acknowledged, due to her lack of prior offending, she may be eligible for diversion. Another hearing is set down for this time next week, where she'll be sentenced if diversion isn't appropriate. Of course, that still leaves open the possibility to the judge of a discharge without conviction, or even a conviction and discharge.
So, has she given any explanation at all for the offending?
In a word, no. Immediately after her arrest, she offered no explanation for leaving the managed isolation facility to police officers. And today, as she left court with a hood over her head and her face partially covered, she made no comment to the gathered media outside the Dunedin District Court. However, her lawyer has only recently taken on the case, but I imagine if she comes before the court again next week, we'll learn more about her motives then.
You mentioned that in the circumstances leading up to her escape, that she, while appeared distressed, was talking to herself. Do we know what led to that distress?
No, there's been no discussion of what led to her being in that state or what the mental health concerns were before that. They just know that on the evening of her escape, approximately 30 minutes before she climbed the wall and fled, she started to show signs of distress in the outside courtyard, which was reserved for recreation, as they describe it, but it was a smoking area.
And that was our Otago Southland reporter, Timothy Brown there. It is, well, it's 17 minutes away from 6. I'm Lisa Owen and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. As always, we're really keen to hear from you. You can text us on 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison has cut short a trip to Queensland to focus on the country's COVID-19 crisis. Victoria reported 384 new cases today, down from the record 532 yesterday. Another 6 people have died, 4 of them linked to aged care homes. The Prime Minister says the outbreak in such facilities is becoming a major concern for health officials.
The situation in Victoria aged care is very complex. You have a combination of the community transmission, which is widespread in Melbourne, finding its way into many facilities. And in particular, it has found its way into the aged care workforce. The standing down, necessarily, of many in that workforce has had a very significant disruption to the provision of care in those facilities.
At least 80 aged care facilities have coronavirus outbreaks and almost 700 workers and patients are infected. Victorian Premier Daniel Andrews says all elective surgery, other than the most urgent operations, will be put on hold to increase capacity in the health system.
Staff is the biggest issue. It's not so much about equipment. It's not so much about capacity in a physical sense. It's about having staff who are able to provide care and support to the most vulnerable residents in and coming out of private sector aged care. To that end, I can also inform you, just by way of example, and this will be occurring in many different settings, Eastern Health and the Eye and Ear Hospital are closing beds currently. They will then move staff, principally registered nurses, Victorian government employed registered nurses, into a number of aged care settings where there are outbreaks to provide care and support to essentially take over the clinical care of residents in those settings.
Victorian Premier Daniel Andrews. Just like Australia, the US is experiencing state-by-state complications as it battles to contain the coronavirus pandemic. It's the country with the highest number of cases, more than 4 million, and the highest death toll, nearly 150,000. Now there are calls for a singular nationwide strategy to fight the virus. CNN's Nick Watt reports.
More than 5,000 souls now lost to COVID-19 in Texas alone, a state now dealing with a virus and a hurricane.
All of these people are going to have to go to shelters. And just think about it for a second. Shelters are going to be like giant Petri dishes as far as coronavirus goes.
Google just told 200,000 employees nationwide they can work from home nearly another year, at least. And tonight, the Miami Marlins will not be playing their home opener, postponed after 11 more players and 2 coaches tested positive, according to ESPN. The Yankees-Phillies game also off, while MLB conducts more testing. Across Florida, nearly 8,000 children tested positive for COVID-19 in just 8 days, but the governor still pushing schools to reopen in August and won't mandate masks.
He and the president have failed every child and teacher and educator in Florida and put them at risk because of their reckless efforts to reopen schools.
Florida just surpassed New York now with the second most confirmed cases in the country, behind only California, where the average daily death toll is now higher than it has ever been. Here, much of the reopening or rolling back is county by county.
Well, we're a big state, and one of the things that we've been advocating and always advocating is follow what's happening on the local level. I think that's the key to success.
Some medical experts strongly disagree, now calling for a nationwide lockdown.
We're one big country, and we're seeing the virus spread.
It's whack-a-mole. It's playing ping-ponging back and forth between the states. That will continue for years if we don't have a singular national strategy, all in marching to the tune of the same drummer. And that drummer should be wearing a mask.
Here's the issue. South Carolina just reported a record high death toll over the weekend, and now vacationers returning from the likes of Myrtle Beach are being blamed in part for a spike in Kentucky.
Kentucky is in that spot right now, where if we don't act, we will look a lot like states in the South that are facing devastating consequences.
That report from CNN's Nick Watt. And back home now, shocking new details have emerged in the case of a man whose body was found in a shallow grave in the central North Island. Wang Bao-chung, known as Ricky Wang, went missing in 2017 and his body was found buried near Tongariro in March. Mr Wang's close friend, Piao Yen Long, was today sentenced to 14 months for helping to cover up the killing, which was allegedly carried out by 2 other men who are yet to stand trial for murder. Matthew Tunison was in court.
Defence lawyer Scott McColgan said that in August of 2017, Piao was driven to the site of Mr Wang's killing by one of the accused murderers who was carrying a gun.
When he arrived at that address, he walked into a scene that, as I've described it in the sentencing submissions, was to Mr Piao, and I suggest would be to each and every one of us, cognitively overwhelming with what he saw and what he found in relation to his, up to that point, friend. And if you want to look at planning and being considered, the purpose of that by the principal offenders was to induce in him passivity and compliance, and that's exactly what it achieved.
In the early hours of Tuesday the 22nd, they took vehicles from the West Auckland property and headed to an isolated location off the desert road. Piao was driving a van with Mr Wang's body in the back. They dug a shallow grave and poured concrete over the top, entombing the body for nearly 3 years. Mr McColgan said that had it not been for Mr Piao coming forward to police, Mr Wang may never have been found.
There is only one reason that we are here today, and that is because of Mr Piao. Simply put, without him, without his unprovoked approach to law enforcement, we would probably not be here. Mr Wang's family would not be in a position to properly inter him, and other offenders associated with the actual murder would not be before the courts.
Mr Wang's ex-wife, with whom he had 2 young children, submitted a statement to the court, which was read by prosecutor David Johnstone.
I cannot imagine that such a brutal person would kill him and the brutal death he endured. I cannot imagine Ricky's bitter plea for help before he was killed. Now we have lost a deeply loved person in our lives, and we are all suffering from this immense pain.
She described Mr Wang as someone with a happy nature, courage and integrity, whose life was full of kindness and love.
Wang Bochang used to be our guardian, and now he has left us. When the children ask of their father, I would find it hard to explain to them.
Justice Jargos imposed a significantly reduced sentence as a result of Piao's cooperation with authorities. He sentenced him to 14 months imprisonment, which is on top of a 4-year jail sentence he's already serving for drug offending.
Your offending is aggravated by its inherent callousness in disposing and concealing Mr Wang's body, and in a way that amounted to its cruel desecration by entombing it in concrete at an isolated location.
Piao, who had an interpreter in court, moved to New Zealand from China to study in 2002 when he was 20 years old. He worked as a housing developer and owned a massage parlour. The court was told his businesses went under after he loaned Mr Wang $350,000, which was not repaid.
You told the Department of Corrections pre-sentence report writer you were really good friends with Mr Wang and with his family. Mr Wang's family are victims of your offending, being disadvantaged by it. Mr Wang was his parents' only child. His father has kept news of his death from his mother for fear her frail health could not stand the shock as he experienced, suffering a heart attack and weight loss.
2 men have pleaded not guilty to Mr Wang's murder and are due to go on trial next year. In Auckland for Checkpoint, call Matthew Tunison 10A.
From stormy seas to plain sailing, the America's Cup is prone to sudden changes of tack. The regatta was due to attract a host of international tourists to our shores and give the economy, including local retailers and hospitality businesses, a big boost. Now businesses are hoping Kiwis will visit Auckland for the prestigious event and spend their dollars in the central business district. Video journalists Simon Rogers and Amy Williams filed this report.
The America's Cup base platforms are finished and Team New Zealand's challengers are in various stages of building their headquarters. Completing the base foundations is a welcome milestone for Wynyard Edge Alliance, the team overseeing construction projects on Auckland's waterfront. Auckland Council's Director of Infrastructure and Environmental Services, Barry Potter, says progress is on track.
It's pretty cool. I'm a yachty. So, this is a pretty neat event, very exciting. Great to see it coming together. And big projects have their moments. Every big project does. This has been a really successful project. The Wynyard Edge Alliance has delivered a great outcome here, on track, on time, and coming in nicely on budget or under budget.
The council is forking out $113 million for the America's Cup, comprising $71 million towards building the team base and berths, $34 million for other commercial and base costs, and $7.3 million for event-related services. Another $100 million is being used to accelerate big infrastructure works that had already been planned to upgrade Auckland's dilapidated waterfront. Mr Potter says the roads leading to Wynyard Quarter, except for Quay Street, will be clear of roadworks in time for the America's Cup World Series in December. The famed road cones on Quay Street along the waterfront will be gone by March in time for the main regatta.
The other works that are outside of this immediate project in the downtown program and with City Rail Link, Albert Street will be completed by Christmas, Lower Queen Street will be completed by Christmas, Quay Street will be substantially complete by the end of the year. There's some work that won't be finished on the northern side of Quay Street that will be finished later in 2021, first half of 2021.
And so when people come into the city for the America's Cup, what will it be like? Will they have clear access?
Great access, great spaces, lovely trees, very different from what it's been. Totally transformational, the work that's being done at the moment.
Without international visitors, the America's Cup will not be the economic turbocharge local businesses hoped for. 3 years ago, the regatta's potential economic boost to the country's economy was estimated at up to $1 billion, although at the time that number was criticised as being overblown. Now it's anyone's guess, with many businesses caught in the headwinds of a global pandemic and international tourists off the cards. Auckland Business Association, heart of the city, has more than 10,000 businesses within its jurisdiction. Its chief executive, Viv Beck, says sales are down almost a quarter in the central business district.
It's been a pretty challenging time in the city centre. We've had a bit of a perfect storm, really, with no international tourists, no international students, no large-scale events, and people working from home. So that's had a big impact.
She says businesses will be holding out for any kind of boost.
I think if Kiwis do decide that this is something to mark on their calendar, which we certainly hope they will, and we get significant numbers of people coming in, that will have benefits. It might not be the benefits we'd initially thought, but that will have benefits for businesses that have been particularly hurt through this time.
Are you hoping that it'll even save some businesses?
Well, that would be great. I mean, anything that can really can remind people. I mean, one of the things we're trying to do is remind people of what a great offering we've got, encourage them to come and enjoy it.
The restaurants and cafes at Wynyard Quarter will have front row seats to much of the America's Cup action on and off the water. Rushworth Cafe manager Salama Lowe says her team serves sailors from both sides.
We serve the team at Emirates Team New Zealand every morning. We're getting some of the American Magic team through as well, and hopefully soon the UK team and also Prada when they come through as well. Yeah, so it's a great little hub here, and I think also, customers seeing them as well creates a nice little vibe as well.
With no international tourists visiting for the Cup, Ms Lowe says the spin-offs may be less tangible.
It's hard to say really, and I think now that it's going to be a smaller event, I think, it's all a bit unknown, but I do think it is a boost that is welcome.
Ms Lowe says they hope the America's Cup events will bring more people into town. For Checkpoint, Amy Williams.
Spain is hoping to convince Britain to make the Balearic and Canary Islands exempt from a 14-day quarantine measure for passengers returning to the UK. Several other Spanish regions said they also Several other Spanish regions said they also feel unfairly penalised by the sweeping move brought in with just 6 hours' notice over the weekend. Adam Reid from Reuters reports.
The Spanish government is continuing to press the UK to lift its blanket and unexpected quarantine on Spain, or at least exempt certain regions such as Spanish islands. Spain's tourism minister, Reyes Morato, hopes exemptions for the Balearic and Canary Islands specifically could be sorted very quickly, either today rather than tomorrow. More travel disruption could be on the way as well. On Monday, Britain said it is watching coronavirus cases in Germany and France closely and continuously reviewing the situation in those countries. London's decision to impose a 14-day quarantine on travellers from Spain has disrupted travel plans of tens of thousands of British holidaymakers, a major asset for the Spanish tourism economy in an already hugely disrupted holiday season. But infection rates are very low on the Balearic and Canary Islands compared to hotspots like Barcelona. Madrid is now working on regaining confidence and convincing other countries that flare-ups of coronavirus cases are under control. Meanwhile, in Barcelona, officials also said Monday that they may take stricter measures to limit coronavirus contagion if things do not improve in the next 10 days. Catalonia leaders have already imposed restrictions on people's movements, activities and businesses, but have warned they will go further if necessary. They've also issued a warning to young people in the area, telling them to stop partying or risk going back into lockdown.
And that was Adam Reid reporting. Lots of feedback on managed isolation and charging for it. This person suggests, how about making isolation free once for everyone? That should be easy enough, they say. That's enough to get everyone home who wants to be home, but avoids subsidising people's holidays. Interesting suggestion. Let us know what you think.
RNZ News at 6. Ngā mihi nui ko Susana Leia Tawa tēnei. The Prime Minister has described New Zealand's relationship with China as mature when asked if suspending the extradition treaty with Hong Kong will be damaging. China has described the move as gross interference. New Zealand has suspended the treaty in light of China's controversial national security law. Jacinda Ardern says in some instances New Zealand will take a different position from that of China, and this is one of those times. She was asked if this will damage the relationship.
We do have a mature relationship with China. There have been occasions where we have taken different positions. This obviously will be one of them. But we take the same approach to our relationship we always have. We've been very consistent.
The government says it will review its decision if China returns to its previously committed position on Hong Kong. A public law expert says the government has a difficult job coming up with the right legislation to charge returning New Zealanders for the cost of isolation hotels. The Prime Minister is promising an announcement very, very soon and is confident she will not have to rely on National's help. The Greens will only support a charge for people who are heading away now on an overseas holiday or business trip. Lawyer Mei Chen says working out who should pay and how much is complicated.
We then need to have exemptions. Some people aren't going to be able to afford that, but they still need to come back. So what do we do? Do we give them exemptions? Do we means test them? The issue here is being fair. Enforcement is also hard. What happens if they don't pay? Are you going to throw them in jail?
Lawyer Mei Chen. A Countdown supermarket in Christchurch has closed for the day after a person who flew from the city to South Korea tested positive for COVID-19. In a statement, the store, which is situated in Spitfire Square near Christchurch Airport, says it was contacted by the Canterbury DHB in relation to the movement of the traveller. It says the shop is thoroughly cleaned each day, but as a precaution, it is shut to undertake a deeper clean. The government has identified 170 close contacts of the infected traveller, with nearby passengers from their flight NZ555 and the traveller's family members being asked to isolate and get tested. Nationals pollster David Farrer has been called in to brief the party's MPs in an effort to keep up morale after this week's bruising public poll. Nationals leader Judith Collins has spent the week insisting the opposition's support is far higher than the 25% recorded by News Hub Read Research. Here's our Deputy Political Editor Craig McCulloch.
RNZ has been told Mr Farrer briefed MPs this morning on two sets of numbers covering different time periods. The key figures shared had National on 36% and Labour below but near 50%. On that result, National would again be consigned to opposition. The fact those numbers are being celebrated and leaked to media is a sign of how much trouble the party's in. From Parliament, Craig McCulloch.
Ambulance workers are heading to court to challenge St John after the charity announced it couldn't afford a planned pay boost. First Union has lodged an application with the Employment Relations Authority, claiming the service has breached an agreement to pay weekend and overnight shift rates. St John says it's facing a $30 million shortfall and can't afford the rates right now. The union's spokesperson, Sarah Stone, says that's not good enough.
And so they haven't applied for funding to cover it. They haven't produced any evidence to show that they can't afford it. And so our only option left was to go and file it with the Employment Relations Authority and take them to court and settle the matter in court.
St John says it's unable to discuss the case before the ERA, but it is paying a smaller unsociable allowance payment while the discussions are ongoing. It's coming up to 6:04. Once the competition strugglers, outgoing Central Pulse coach Yvette McCausland-Jury is most pleased with creating a franchise that is now respected on the national netball scene. McCausland-Jury is stepping down at the end of the season as the Pulse chase back-to-back ANZ Premiership titles. She became head coach in 2017, guiding the Pulse to the grand final the following year before winning the title for the first time in 2019.
When you're in a really tough space, you can only get better. But I also was really clear that if we could sustain a good group of people over a period of time, we were going to be contenders. And what I wanted from the start was that we were a team who were respected. That was the ultimate goal.
Meanwhile, already riven with injuries, the Southern Steel have suffered yet another blow, with the third shooter ruled out due to injury. Import player Khalifa McCollin sprained her ankle in Sunday's win over the Northern Mystics and will miss this weekend's round of matches. England's cricketers' hopes of clinching a series win over the West Indies rest with the weather gods. Day 4 at Old Trafford and Manchester was a washout, and the Windies will resume tonight on the fifth and final day of the third test at 10-2 in the second innings, still needing another 389 runs to win. However, rain is again forecast throughout the day. The series is level at 1-1. And Qatar, who are to host the 2022 Men's Football World Cup, are keen to stage the 2032 Olympics. That's the news.
Tonight on Night, Susie Ferguson presents episode 2 of The Unthinkable loss of a child. This evening, that experience from the father's point of view. And in these COVID times, our philosopher Anne Kerwin turns to the philosophy of William James. Don't overinvest in your current truth, he said. Be ready to revise, but believe life is worth living, and your belief will help create that fact. On Nights with me, Brian Crump, after the news at 7 on RNZ National.
Now the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow. Northland, Coromandel and Bay of Plenty. Partly cloudy with isolated light showers. Clearing Bay of Plenty tomorrow morning. Auckland to Wellington, including Taumaranui and Taupo. Fine and cloudy periods. Isolated showers in Waikato. Areas of fog north of Whanganui tomorrow morning. Gisborne to Wairarapa, also Taihape. Fine. Some high cloud. Areas of morning frost or fog. Nelson, Buller and Northern Westland, cloud increasing. A few showers tonight. Southern Westland and Fiordland, cloud increasing, periods of rain tonight. Marlborough and Canterbury, high cloud. However, areas of low cloud or fog affecting eastern Canterbury at times. For Otago and Southland, high cloud, rain at times tomorrow. And Chatham Islands, cloudy periods. RNZ National, 6:30
Thanks, Susanna. Kia ora anō. This is Checkpoint and I'm Lisa Owen. The opposition National Party has brought in its pollster to brief MPs in a bid to discredit this week's devastating public poll result. And MPs are already leaking the party's supposed internal numbers to media. It comes as the party hits yet another road bump, with a photo circulating of National's teen candidate appearing to impersonate Hitler. Here's our Deputy Political Editor, Craig McCulloch.
Judith Collins is sick of talking about polls. She spent the past few days dismissing News Hub Reid Research's survey as a rogue result after it showed them plumbing the depths of 25%. Today she came armed to National's regular caucus meeting with the party's internal polling for her MP's eyes only.
I'm happy to provide those through to the National Party caucus. I'm not going to give them to you.
It didn't matter. Within hours of the meeting's close, RNZ was leaked details of what went on behind the closed doors. We're told the caucus was briefed by the party's pollster, David Farrer, who provided MPs with 2 sets of figures over different time periods. The headline numbers as such: National on 36%, Labour just behind 50%, the Greens on 6%, and New Zealand First and ACT on 3%. The numbers are a far sight better for National than News Hub Reid Researchers, but even with that result, the party would again be consigned to opposition. And the fact those numbers are celebrated, indeed leaked to media, is a sign of how much trouble the party is in.
Voters do trust me, and they'll trust me significantly more than the nonsense that we've seen in your poll.
The new leader's trustworthiness was tested again today, forced to admit she was not entirely accurate when she took aim at the government's handling of managed isolation, Well, in Palmerston North yesterday.
When I was Minister of Corrections, nobody escaped.
Except that's not true. Official figures show more than 20 prisoners made a runner during Ms Collins' various stints as Minister of Corrections.
Oh, there was the odd one who might have popped out, but they all got caught.
Caught and confronted with the facts today, she told reporters they needed to get a sense of humour.
Do you not understand a joke? It's very okay to have a joke. What do you really do want to bone up on your comedy skills? When my eyebrow goes up, it's a joke.
But jokes can be dangerous territory. Just ask the party's teenage candidate, William Wood, who just yesterday was paraded around beside Ms Collins on the campaign trail.
Doesn't he remind you of one of those historical figures like William Pitt the Younger, who I think was Prime Minister at the age of about 23?
It was a different historical figure getting the 18-year-old in trouble today. A photo posted on social media showing the boy appearing to impersonate Adolf Hitler. He has a white painted-on moustache and is performing a Nazi salute. In a statement, William Wood says the photo was taken 4 years ago when he was 14. It was an error, he says. I apologise for any offence. National MPs learnt the news this afternoon.
Well, I don't make up anything. Boys will be boys. What happens in life, isn't it?
OK, look, that's really between him and his electorate and the party. I don't have a view on that here now, and I haven't seen it, so I'm afraid you'll need to take that up with him.
And other party leaders were also showing some restraint.
I wouldn't punish someone for something they did when they were 14. I'd just tell them I thought it was very bad taste.
Look, we all make mistakes when we're young. I would think it's part of the growing up process. And by the looks of it, he's still growing up.
The opposition again struggling with distractions. Not what's needed to turn the polling around. From Parliament for Checkpoint, Craig McCulloch.
More than 3 million of us are currently enrolled to vote in the upcoming general election. Many will be voting for the first time, but with the inclusion of 2 referendums, the End of Life Choice Act and the Cannabis legalisation and control bill, it's not just politicians vying for our attention. So how well do we understand what's being asked of us? Well, Alex Perrottet and cameraman Nick Monroe popped into David Seymour's Epsom electorate, where they got schooled by a bunch of rookies.
Life-changing decisions are just around the corner for many New Zealanders, young and old. So it's not the time for playing around. Thousands of the country's freshly minted first-time voters are still at school.
The Electoral Commission has sent out material to voters and also sent its staff to schools to ensure that eligible Year 13 students are registered to vote. So we thought we'd visit Auckland Grammar here in David Seymour's electorate of Epsom to see if students here know what questions they have to answer.
Well, there should be 4. You've got your local, you've got your party, and then you've got the 2 referendums.
Well, there's 2 referendums, aren't there? So they're asking about the marijuana and the end-of-life choice.
Should we legalise euthanasia, and should we legalise weed?
Will it be 4? So you've got the party vote, the electorate vote, the marijuana referendum, and the euthanasia referendum, the end-of-life bill.
So referendums are for legalisation of recreational cannabis and for legalisation of assisted euthanasia.
What are they asking you to choose regarding cannabis?
Whether or not it should be legal recreationally for people who are of a certain age and under certain circumstances.
What age is it, do you know?
I've actually forgotten.
20.
Okay.
So 20 years old, you can legally smoke marijuana. Is that a good thing?
I think that it's not necessarily a good thing to smoke marijuana, but I think it's a good thing to have it legal so then you can regulate and stuff because people are doing it anyway. So may as well make it more safe and for everyone.
What are they asking you about weed?
They're asking if we should move it from a drug that is legal to a regulated substance that you can buy as just a member of the public.
Is it recreational use and you can carry up to a certain amount, I can't remember how much, and then can you grow 2 plants within your own home or something?
I'm pretty sure it's the 14 grams over 20, if that should be, that's what they're proposing anyway, for sale, and also I think it's 2 plants per person and 4 each household or something like that.
2 per person and 4 per household.
So you've read up on this?
Yeah, I got the pamphlet about it.
You sat down and had a good read?
I had a little look through it.
How many people your age do you think do that? Get all the information in the mail, open it up, sit down and read it?
Not enough, to be honest. I'm kind of worried about that, to be honest.
These scholars are serious. They had no warning we were coming to see them today, but lucky for us, they were happy to interrupt their meeting with a Reserve Bank chairman to make some time to enlighten us on their very considered views.
What do you think about cannabis? I'm not a huge fan of cannabis. I think that New Zealand's got a bit of a problem already with alcohol. I think that I understand the reasons why people might want to legalise marijuana. You've got, trying to crack down on illegal supplies and so on and so forth, but I think it's just adding to the problem that we've already got here.
If I were to vote tomorrow, I'd probably vote for. I just think that if it is controlled and policed reasonably strictly, then it does take the power out of the black markets.
I think it's a tough one. I know at the moment, drink driving is a massive issue, driving under the influence. I know that we don't really have an easy way to test for cannabis in the system, and that's something that road deaths are a huge issue. So you really want to keep an eye on that.
What about euthanasia? Euthanasia is a bit of a tricky issue. Obviously, we don't want people to be suffering, but that being said, there are some important ethical questions to be asking. The limits that are being drawn in this particular referendum, for example, terminal illness, you've got about 6 months of life left, 18 and over, New Zealand permanent resident or citizen. These lines that are being drawn, you've got an unbearable suffering, or, there's a very low possibility or no possibility of improvement. You need to also be asking the important ethical questions that, who's drawing these lines? Are these the only lines that we can draw? Is it a grey area or is it black and white? So a lot of... Do you think, is it grey?
It is a grey area, obviously, because suffering by its very nature is not an absolute.
I think that should definitely be legal as well. Give people back their dignity, and if someone's in pain, they should have the option to put themselves out of it.
What this euthanasia bill really does give is it gives people dignity. You don't want people having to put themselves in a position where they have to end their life in a way that doesn't give them, in a way that's painful, or that someone else has to deal with it. It's sort of trying to lessen the burden of that passing on to the wider society.
So down the road in Newmarket's Broadway, it's time to ask the general public whether they too have done their homework on the referendum questions.
Do you know what they are?
I have no idea.
Have you received election material in the mail?
I got a voting paper. I think that's pretty much all I've got.
Just checking that your address is the correct one.
Yeah.
So you will vote on election day?
Yes, I will.
I do think that it's probably important for medicinal use. There seems to be a lot of evidence.
Now you know that this cannabis choice is not about medicinal use but recreational use.
Oh, I didn't really know that, but but I'm hoping one leads to the other.
So what are the two other questions you're going to be asked at the ballot box?
One's about cannabis, and the other one was... I should know this. Gone from me at the moment.
You've got 50% on the exam at the moment.
It's not good. No.
Euthanasia.
Oh, of course, yeah.
There are two, one on euthanasia and one on cannabis.
That's great, 100%, well done.
Right, great.
So any idea of how you might vote?
Definitely, I've sorted it all out, looked at all the literature, and I've decided on which way I'm going to vote.
What about the two referendum questions? Do you know what they are?
Not really. Can you believe it that I don't follow the politics, but I know who I'm going to vote?
Oh, yeah. The referendum and the memory loss. Drugs.
Marijuana and euthanasia, yeah.
Passable, but some might want to get back home and look at those Electoral Commission flyers. But fully informed or not, these punters seem to know which way they're going.
Medicinal marijuana I agree with because it helps with people with pain and things like that, but the normal smoking of marijuana, I don't believe in smoking at all anyway.
Probably leaning towards voting yes on both of them.
If you ask me, both of them should be legal.
Both of them should be legal?
I would say both of them legal.
Right.
Yeah.
And why is that?
Because if they make the marijuana legal, it would be less crime, I believe. And also it's good. It has some health beneficial fact on it, so why not?
With cannabis, I still don't believe that I believe that there is a health issue to it, and that's why I'm voting against it.
Cannabis, I probably will go no, and euthanasia, I'll go yes.
So if it's just memory loss, or if you're a little hazy on the detail, here it is one more time. Firstly, for cannabis,
2 plants per person, max of 4 per household, and other stats such as that, like over 20, I think the age was. Yeah, and a certain number of grams, I think 14 off the top of my head.
And what are they asking you about with euthanasia?
That's the one looking at over 18, 6 months out of a terminal illness, in extreme pain or suffering, in a good frame of mind, acceptable frame of mind for it.
and a final message to the public that there is still time and the information is readily available.
Where did you get the information from?
You've got referendum.gov.nz, I think, so that's got some pretty good stats on there.
Are you worried that a lot of people won't be informed voters?
Yeah, they sort of walk in and just tick whatever they feel like on the day. They don't know what they're really voting for.
For Checkpoint, Alex Perrottet.
And that was Alex Perrottet and Nick Munro there in the Auckland electorate of Epsom. And my goodness me, weren't those some remarkably well-informed young men at high school there? We will put that piece up online on our Facebook page so you can check it out. And don't forget, you can enrol to vote right up to and including the day of the election. It is almost 6:20. You're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. This issue of paying for managed isolation has really got you guys thinking. This person says a definite no to a mandatory payment for quarantine, but think they should pay for food and drinks. Then the family could support them with that. There needs to be options if you are asking people to pay, this listener says. What happens to the law after COVID? That's a good question. Another person says, please charge a fee like yesterday. Make the fee tax deductible in New Zealand, 5 years to claim. If you can't afford it, you can get a student loan. If you struggle to repay the loan, go through the same process as students. Simple, done. We're going down the plug hole with a ball and chain of debt. We can't afford to foot this bill for expat Kiwis, fed up and frustrated from Wellington, says that. Erin from Christchurch says, can't believe that New Zealand would charge returning Kiwis for COVID isolation. Completely different for people knowing the risks of COVID now and choosing to leave and return. They should pay. Another one here from Jonathan says, the clear beneficiary of 2 weeks isolation are the New Zealanders that are already in the country, not those arriving. On that basis, we should pay for those returning with a clear catch for anyone who leaves the country for a holiday. Another one says, charge everyone who leaves and returns for overseas trips, business, holidays or visiting family. Charge New Zealanders coming home for Christmas or a holiday who intend to go back overseas as they earn, spend and pay taxes in their country of work. Yes, charge New Zealanders returning to live and work in New Zealand. Perhaps a refund if they stay in New Zealand for 12 months. Interesting suggestion there. But someone else says, what about elderly parents with children and grandchildren in Australia who have been long-term residents? Will they ever be able to see them again? How can they afford to bring whole families to visit in New Zealand, especially with 2 weeks of the visit spent in managed isolation? While supporters of an appeal to stop a major water bottling consent heckled and yelled from the public gallery of the High Court today as lawyers for Creswell New Zealand Limited defended its bid to take 1 billion litres of water a year from the Waiti aquifer. Ngāti Awa is challenging the Bay of Plenty Regional Council's decision to grant the company consent to expand an existing water bottling plant near Whakatane. Te Aniwa Hurihanganui filed this report from the High Court in Rotorua.
The court was interrupted on several occasions today as members from the public gallery shouted greedy and we don't want your jobs. Creswell New Zealand Limited, a subsidiary of Chinese company Nongfu Spring, not only wants to take more water from the aquifer but build 2 new bottling lines, each producing 72,000 bottles an hour. Te Runanga o Ngāti Awa believe that will have an irrecoverable impact on the mauri or life force of the water because once the water is bottled and exported, it's gone forever, making it impossible for its mauri to be restored. The lawyer for Creswell, Dave Randall, was interrupted by people in the public gallery as he explained evidence by a Ngāti Awa cultural advisor, He Mama Eruera, contradicted that view.
And the Environment Court instead preferred the evidence of another esteemed kaumātua of Ngāti Awa, and indeed the Vice Chair of Te Kahuiko Matua, there's some talk of that body yesterday, so that's a body formally tasked with advising Te Runanga on matters of tikanga and matters of Māori, and found that there is no loss of Māori from the water.
Creswell consulted directly with Mr Eruera during its planning stages and was advised that while Māori can be depleted, it can also be restored through tikanga practices. Mr Randall told the judge every requirement under the RMA was met by his client, the statement sparking outcry from the public gallery yet again.
It doesn't really matter where you look, sir. There is nothing in the plans, there's nothing in the regional policy statement, there's nothing in the operative regional natural resources plan, nothing in Plan Change 9 as it was, that supports the outcome sought by the appellants here, particularly given the explicit findings on the evidence that here exporting water does not in fact adversely affect its Māori or the ability of Ngāti Aotearoa and Koutou.
How would you know?
Mr Randall noted the proposed water take is well within the interim allocation of water. He also referred back to a key finding of the Environment Court last year, that the impact of plastic waste was outside of the court's jurisdiction because bottles do not in itself require a resource consent. Ngāti Awa has argued that because the Environment Court closed its mind to the impact of plastic waste, it therefore failed to comprehensively assess how the bottling of the water and the export could have cultural impacts at a local level. However, the lawyer for the Bay of Plenty Regional Council, Mary Hill, rejected that.
The issue was clearly framed in this way by the Regional Council before the Environment Court, that Māori and tikanga effects are personal experiences occurring at source, where tangata whenua are situated, rather than where the end use occurs. Clearly they addressed the cultural effects of that export.
She says the 3 expert planners who were called to give evidence at the Environment Court support her client's view that the proposal does not impede on kaitiakitanga.
The important point in my submission, sir, is that all planners did agree that the plans provide comprehensive provisions regarding kaitiakitanga.
Mo te hōtaka o te ahiahi, ko te aniwa, hurihanga nui, aho.
And after we played that piece from Alex Perrottet, which was talking to the grammar boys in Auckland about the referendum, Louise has got in touch to say, congratulations to grammar. Those boys are very well informed. Well, bad news for al fresco diners in France. All outdoor heaters and air conditioners are to be banned. The country's ecology minister made the announcement today, saying they're bad for the environment. The BBC's Paul Hawkins reports.
The famous outdoor Parisian cafe culture. All year round, it's what France is known for, thanks to outdoor heaters. But this is set to change because the government says they're bad for the environment.
We will also ban outdoor heating in public spaces and restaurant terraces and require the closing of doors of all heated or air-conditioned buildings that are open to the public. This is about ending practices that constitute ecological aberrations that lead to a completely unjustified overconsumption of energy. We cannot, for the mere comfort of not having to open the doors of a shop, air-condition the street in the middle of summer when it's 30 degrees. And we also cannot fully heat terraces in the middle of winter when it's 0 degrees. For the mere pleasure of drinking one's coffee outdoors while staying warm.
Trade groups say more than 75% of restaurants and cafes in Paris have a heated terrace. And even though the government says the ban won't come in until after the winter because of COVID-19, many cafe and restaurant owners are anxious.
I am worried about losing turnover in the winter. Most of our turnover comes from the summer. During the winter, it is always a plus to have heaters on terraces for clients who want to smoke and to drink, even if it is cold. So for sure, I think our turnover will decrease in winter.
Environmental groups say France has at least 12,500 heated terraces. One of those groups has even calculated that a 75-metre square terrace heated with gas for 5 months emits as much carbon dioxide as a car circling the Earth 3 times.
I think there are more important things to do for climate change than banning heaters on terraces. There are better things to do than depriving restaurant owners of their heated terraces.
A few French cities have already banned heaters, but the mayor of Paris refused to do so because of the impact on businesses. Despite that, some people think it's a good idea.
Look, I go to terraces which aren't heated. Heaters appeared and it was amazing progress, but everybody knows we don't really need it. I stay warm with a little jacket or with something that's sufficiently warm to stay out on the terraces, drinking an aperitif or a coffee. I don't need a heater.
And that's the government's point. The debate over heaters is a lot of hot air, they say. Wear a jacket or use a blanket instead.
And that was Paul Hawkins reporting. Thank you for all your feedback this evening. A lot of you have strong views on whether returning Kiwis should be paying for isolation and quarantine. And I think it's fair to say, based on the unofficial survey of your feedback, most think that people should be contributing in some way to that cost. This one from Judy says, families went short of wages during lockdown. Should they be paying for travellers to come back? Make them pay 75% costs on an interest-free loan. Thanks, Judy. Judy's basically reflecting a lot of the views that you've been sending in tonight. On St John Ambulance, this person says, perhaps however many millions given to Team New Zealand could be matched every time to St John's Ambulance. Don't forget you can go online and check out our stories, especially that video piece from Alex Perrottet and Nick Munro on the referendums. Back tomorrow.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. The opposition backs New Zealand's decision to suspend its extradition treaty with Hong Kong, but say it's been too slow to act. A Countdown supermarket in Christchurch has closed for the day after a person who flew from the city to South Korea tested positive for COVID-19. Ambulance workers have taken St John to court after the charity announced it couldn't afford a planned pay boost. And National's pollster has been called in to brief the party's MPs after this week's bruising public poll put it at 25%. Those are the headlines. Our next news will be at 7.
Take the pulse of the day's news every weeknight at 10.
Like, we can laugh about not drinking bleach, but then if you've got a family member, someone you love, someone you do anything for, and you've got people telling you that this will save them, how do you know what you're going to do in that situation?
Live with local, national and international stories as they happen.
Relations between the US and China and the UK